Good afternoon and welcome to another of the Skype interviews from Talk Wildlife. Today I've got with me Sarah Harris from the BTO. Sarah is the BBS National Organiser, which is a big title there. We'll talk about what BBS is in a second, but first of all, hi Sarah, how are you?
Hi, yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah, relieved now the report's out and with everybody.
Sorry?
Relieved now the report's out and with everybody.
Yeah, and lots of people do look forward to it, but we better really tell them what it is first of all. So tell them what BBS stands for first of all.
So the BBS is the Breeding Bird Survey, and this is a UK-wide survey whereby volunteers go out and survey a 1 kilometre square twice a year, and they send all the data from the bird counts from that square into us, and then we can use that in research and produce population trends every year.
Yeah, right. And I believe now this is its 25th report, the 25th report, is that right?
Yeah, so the survey started in 1994, and then there's been an annual report pretty much every year since then.
So that's a lot of data. That'll give you some really good insights at the BTO into what's actually happening with bird trends.
Yeah, definitely. So we can use these data to produce trends, to look at change over time. But the data also feeds into population estimates, where we can look at things like how many pairs of breeding birds there are, and we can kind of update those stats using BBS trends. So it's got a greater use than just the population trends we'll talk about today. Absolutely.
And this doesn't just cover the breeding bird survey, this report as well. It covers mammals and it also covers the wetlands. Is that right?
Waterways, breeding bird survey.
Sorry, waterways, yeah. That's the wetlands. Don't tell Neil I said that. I won't edit that out. We'll leave that in. So yeah, I just want to throw some figures at you just to start, because I think the one thing that this shows is just how brilliant really citizen science projects are. There's some of the figures in the front of your reports that talk about, number one, how many squares were actually surveyed last year, which is just over 4,000 across the UK. You also then, you put a figure here, which is nearly 15,000 kilometres were walked during the surveying by the people doing the survey, which is actually quite a bit.
Yeah. So and the other little fact we've got in there is how far people have walked during active surveys since the survey began, and we can see that's just under 300,000 kilometres. That's nearly gone to the moon. But if you take into account walking to your square and walking between your two transects, obviously those data we haven't got, but they probably reached the moon on the way back. Yeah,
which is incredible really, and it's a real credit to the people that are involved in this. Because clearly, there's a lot of people do it, and it's also it's a joint partnership. This isn't it? It's not just the BTO that do this. It's a joint partnership.
Yeah. So the Breeding Bird Survey, as I say, has been run since 1994, but more recently, the Waterways Breeding Bird Survey was brought into the partnership as well, and this is a partnership between BTO, the RSPB, and JNCC. So between the three organisations, we're now running the BBS and the Waterways Breeding Bird Survey that you mentioned earlier. So together, we're getting a lot of land covered. So for BBS, we're covering kind of all different habitat types and bringing that all together. And obviously for the Waterways Breeding Bird Survey, that's transects along canals, rivers and streams. And that's producing population trends for waterway specialists specifically in that habitat.
Right. Okay. And looking at, again, I'm looking at your statistics page here. This particular report covers 223 bird species. And I just glanced down, and I'm not going to sort of drop anything on you that you didn't already know, but most widespread bird species. This always sort of surprises people when I tell them this. Wood pigeon isn't obvious because everybody sees wood pigeon, but wren, both seen in 90% of the squares surveyed. A lot of people sort of get a little bit, what do you mean a wren? I hardly ever see a wren.
Yeah. But so I think one of the things about that is that we've got obviously the people that go out and carry out the surveys for BBS and WBBS, they're really skilled observers, and so they're listening as well as seeing these birds. And obviously wrens, you tend to hear them rather than see them, and when you're really concentrating on every species on your site, and you're listening to all the birds around you, you're going to be picking up wrens quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll come on to it later, but one bird that used to be actually quite high up there is in sort of significant decline at the moment, which is the chaffinch, and we'll talk about that in further detail later on. But that's quite, that shocked me. That's a worrying statistic. So we'll talk about that later. Right, okay. So what I think I'll do is I'm going to share screen so we can talk through and pick out some of the species on the actual report itself. And then we'll just discuss around them and discuss some of the movement that might be happening due to climate change and all the rest of it. So if you just bear with me a sec, I'll share screen and we'll take it from there. I'm looking at table 4. So if you want to tell me whether you've got table 4 in front of you.
Yep.
Right. OK, so what we've got there is sort of a few that I will pick out. And I think people would not sort of think it was me if I didn't go straight to the waders.
Yeah.
So what I'm looking at there is we've got oystercatcher, lapwing and curlew, and to a small extent golden plover, but it seems to me that waders are going through a really rough patch at the moment, because if you look at that, we've got a decline in significant declines in sort of lapwing and curlew. So I know that there's a curlew project sort of out at the moment through the BTO, and I'm going to talk to Sam about that at some stage. Any idea what sort of, driving that? Anything that, you guys have discussed beforehand?
Yeah, so I think it's mainly, a lot of it started historically and changes in agricultural practices. So we're talking about drainage of kind of wet meadows, increased grazing, those sorts of pressures. But also for curlew, it's this climatic change is causing the species to move further north into cooler climates, but also moving altitudinally as well. So they go heading up the hills and the mountains as the climate becomes warmer, and eventually they'll probably run out of places to go, basically, within the UK anyway. Yeah,
and sort of that trend sort of towards the north and the west sort of seems to be highlighted as well by something like the willow warblers and the blackcaps, and where their range is sort of increasing and extending to, because they're sort of moving over towards sort of, Ireland and that direction. Is that right?
Yeah, so you're seeing, climate change will be having different impacts on different species, and to curlew, obviously they're struggling as they're moving keep carrying on moving northwards. And then you've got things like willow warblers, which appear to be shifting northwards. So you're kind of seeing declines in England, and you're seeing increases in Scotland as the whole population starts to move, the distribution moves northwards. But then you're seeing things like chiffchaff and blackcap, where they're increasing in England and in Scotland, and blackcap specifically in Northern Ireland, they're increasing by over 1,000. Was it 1,500%? I've got the figure right there.
Which bird were you talking about then? I missed it.
Blackcap.
Blackcap. So yeah, blackcap.
1,540%, I think, Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
So chiffchaffs and blackcaps, they're increasing all over. So not only is their range expanding rather than shifting, their abundance is increasing where they started off as well. So you're getting expansions and you're getting shifts between different species caused by climate change. Yeah.
And one that's just jumped out at me now actually is Chetty's warbler. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to sort of explain why there's such an increase, but I mean, it's certainly something that, before I moved down to Norfolk, I used to have to go to sort of one or two places up in the northwest to see Chetty's warbler. They just weren't that common. Well, see them, hear them. But, you come down here, and I came down here about 6, 7 years ago, and they were sort of quite abundant. And now you look at the growth, and it's just exploded. 417% is.
Yeah. So there's two good news stories about this. So we've only just started being able to produce population trends for Chetty's warblers. One of the reasons for that is that we need a big enough sample size. And sample size will be influenced by how widespread a species is, so how often it's getting picked up on different squares, but it will also be influenced by how many people are out doing the surveys. So between the combination of the birds doing well and the volunteers doing a great job in covering lots of squares, we're able to produce the trend, and we're able to see this increase in Chetty's warblers. And for me, I remember as a kid, we never got them at Rymeads in Hertfordshire, where I used to bird every weekend, but they're down there now, so they're back. Oh, they've turned up rather.
Yeah. And again, I'm not going to go into detail about sort of the hows and the whys, but I want to, on this particular page, just pick out another couple of species. So a few species. First of all, the turtle dove. We all know about the turtle dove. We know that's in serious trouble, and we know that there are, projects out there trying to address that. But when you then glance over to the column on the right-hand side, and we look at the sort of the two of the smaller tits, so the marsh tit and the willow tit, their declines are staggering as well. I mean, the willow tit, down, basically 82%. Yeah. So,
I think when we get to the mammal trends, we might find out a little bit possibly about some of the things the willow tits are having to face with browsing of understory in woodlands, and the effect that could be having on the species. But yeah, turtle dove's definitely not alone. There's other things that are showing these really severe declines, for sure.
Yeah. Remind me to talk about willow tit then again when we look at the mammals thing. Again, I won't put you on the spot, but we'll have a chat about that. The other one that I sort of surprised me is the starling. The starling numbers down 53%. This is a bird that sort of, it's on the surface of it can adapt to sort of pretty much anything. It eats pretty much anything, and yet it's showing quite a substantial decline there. Is this, again, if you don't know the answer to this, don't worry about it. But what don't I know about the starling? What's happening with starling numbers? Why is that happening?
I think, again, our farmland's changing a lot, and one of the things that starlings quite like is a bit of mixture in habitat types. So they like to be able to go and forage in a nice field of cattle, and then they like to, obviously they'll be nesting in buildings and little holes in roofs, which are becoming more and more uncommon as people get better at filling up all the gaps around their houses. So we're seeing a lot of farmland that's kind of a monoculture almost, and so they haven't got all the different places that they might want to go and feed in. And then, of course, when they come back to nest, they're struggling then to find somewhere suitable to call home. Yeah,
and then I glanced down at the song thrush, and the song thrush is it's one that's been on the cards for a while, and my soundtrack to my lockdown has been a song thrush. I was just actually, while you were talking earlier on, I was slightly distracted listening out for it because I knew I was going to discuss it.
Yeah.
I can't hear it at the moment, but it has. I mean, literally for 5 weeks now, just over 5 weeks, I've had a single song thrush singing directly opposite our house on the common. It's singing definitely dawn and dusk, and singing pretty much throughout the day, on and off. And I know on the other side of my patch, probably not much more than about 500 yards away, there is a breeding pair of song thrushes. And it's almost like this song thrush here is sort of, it's painting a picture of what is happening with song thrushes by saying, I'm still here, I'm still looking for a mate, and I'm still singing. I really feel like sort of going out there, and we won't say mating with it myself because that would be wrong. But finding a female for it and taking it over, because it really is quite sad to hear it day after day after day. So, but the song thrush on there is, well, she got it highlighted in red. I'm just trying to see where the figure is there. So, song thrush, it's highlighted in red, but it's showing, is that 26% up?
Yeah, increasing. So I think for some of these species, some of these trends anyway, you've got to be a little bit careful that you're looking at where the trend begins. So for tree sparrow is a brilliant example. You can see for the UK an increase of 117% during the breeding bird survey. But what it doesn't show you is prior to the breeding bird survey starting, the species used to be at a far higher level and it dropped off a cliff basically. Then BBS started and it's gone along kind of a little more stable, and there's a little tiny flick at the end of this longer term trend that you're seeing in our kind of 23-year trend of the BBS. So with song thrush, there'll be peaks and troughs in that population, and we're just seeing this little flick there, I should think, at the end.
Yeah. And because we're sort of on the smaller type birds now, let's just talk about greenfinch and in particular chaffinch, because chaffinch is showing a trend of decline, and I think that will surprise a lot of people because chaffinch are sort of quite, common in gardens, quite commonly seen. But obviously the greenfinch, we know that that's been declining for a while. Can you give us a little background to the greenfinch decline first of all, and then we'll talk about the chaffinch? Yeah,
so greenfinch, the breeding bird survey picked up this decline as it started. Well, just after it started, it started to become apparent in the trends. It was about 2007, and the greenfinch has been declining ever since. And it's been linked to a disease called trichomoniasis, which is a parasite that gets lodged in the throat and causes breathing problems and feeding issues. So basically, it kills the birds, and it can be spread on bird feeders, so feeding stations. So it's really important to keep any of your garden feeders clean and disinfected and moved around the garden as well. Can help just to kind of stop or slow the spread of this disease. And so as you mentioned, in more recent years, especially the last 5 and 10 years, we've seen chaffinch have started to decline massively as well. And while we have to be very careful about what we are attributing to these declines, trichomoniasis has been recorded in chaffinch, but we don't know if that's a direct impact on the population change itself. So we need to do further research into what's happening with chaffinches, and the BTO at the minute are running an appeal to try and raise some funds to look into this recent and quite shocking decline in chaffinch numbers. So that's one of our aims for the near term.
Yeah, and I know because recently you made the garden bird watch free whilst people were sort of indoors. There is a portion on that talks about, that asks you basically to report disease. And, that's really important because if you're seeing it, then, obviously you need to know where it is. You can't be everywhere, nor can Kate and all the rest of the team from Garden Birdwatch. So, yeah, people need to be reporting this. Is there a way that they can report it outside if they're not doing the Garden Birdwatch? And if not, why not? But if they're not, if they're not, is there another way that they can actually report the fact that they might have seen a greenfinch or a chaffinch or something like that, that's got a disease?
Yeah, so I think the best thing to do would be to go online and Google Garden Wildlife Health.
Right.
And that will take you through to a website which is linked to Garden Birdwatch, and that will tell you more about what to do if you're seeing any issues with the birds in your garden, and how to report those. So that's Garden Wildlife Health.
Yeah, and what I'll do is I'll put a link to that underneath the interview. So what would people, what's the visible signs? What would they see in a greenfinch or a chaffinch or anything like that might sort of raise alarms?
So I think you'll just see a more lethargic bird that's kind of fluffed up, and he won't be feeding easily as well. He might get a bit choked up when he's trying to feed and drink. But basically, yeah, just getting fluffed up and sitting about looking a bit poorly, really.
Let's move on to the WBBS trends, which is the waterways.
Waterways breeding bird survey, yeah.
Yeah, okay, waterways. Right, okay, so just looking again, I've got to just mention it before we move over to the right-hand side and talk about wagtails. Yeah, they're on there. So oyster catcher, 39% down. Lapwing, 59% down. Curlew, 53% down. Common sandpiper, I think that's a 3, or it's, yeah, I think it's a 3, 33% down. So yeah, so waders are sort of struggling at the moment. That seems quite apparent by some of the figures here.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of mirroring the trends that we're seeing in the breeding bird survey and the overall population changes for the wader species. So obviously people, when they're, well, especially in places like Scotland and the uplands, when they're walking along a stream and the canal waterway, are likely to be going through the the higher density of breeding sites of some of these birds, especially things like common sandpiper. It's one of the real treats of going along the stream in Scotland.
Yeah, it's not great. So I'm going to flick back a screen, just because the yellow wagtail's not on the other one. And here we've got yellow wagtail down 42%, and then here we've got the grey and the pied wagtail both showing declines. Any particular reason for that? Anything that you would be able to sort of share with us?
No, not really. The three wagtail species are a little bit of a mystery. I think for yellow wagtail, you're seeing from the breeding bird survey results, again, it's this drainage of farmland can be an issue. And I think the other thing for yellow wagtail is that they're obviously a long distance migrant. So you don't know what they're facing during their migration and their stopover sites down into Africa and back again, and what habitat changes that might be occurring in Africa as well. So there's lots of different things to take into account for some of these long distance migrants, for sure. Grey wagtail and pied wagtail, I think it's a bit confusing because obviously they're insect feeders. We're seeing some of our insect populations declining at the moment. But actually a recent paper showed that along waterways specifically, with less pollutants along the waterways, insect numbers have been seen to increase just a little bit. So maybe the bird trends will follow along with that. But around the wider countryside, obviously insects are struggling.
Yeah. And then the other notable one there is the sedge warbler. Sedge warbler numbers, I mean, they look in sort of trouble, really. Yeah,
so again, this is, this particularly worries me. It's my favourite bird. But a decline of 63% since the Waterways Breeding Bird Survey started in 1998. And again, they're going down to the Sahel region of Africa, and their populations are heavily influenced by rainfall levels over winter when they're down in Africa. So ideally they'd like a little bit of rain before they get there, and then when they arrive, maybe the rain can die down a bit, but there'll be lots of insects available for them. And then also making sure that they're in prime condition to then migrate back to the UK to breed in the summer, in the spring and summer. So their population can fluctuate, but it doesn't like there's some issues along waterways specifically. The decline in the trend shown by the WBBS is stronger than that of the BBS, where we're looking at all habitat types. So there's definitely room for more research there.
Yeah, I'm just glancing through them, and tufted duck down significantly. Well, we won't mention the lapwing again. I've mentioned that enough. Common tern down slightly. Yeah, so there's, I mean, there's more sort of.
The waterways trends are showing some pretty worrying themes where a lot of the long-term declines, and at least the statistically significant long-term declines, the ones that are, the strongest, but the ones that we have the most confidence in, they're largely showing, well, they're all showing declines. So it's quite worrying, really. Yeah,
I'm looking. There's only 7 there that really are showing reasonably healthy figures. And I mean, we don't really know, the Canada goose and the grey-lag goose, we won't count them. So there's only 5 really. So it is a worrying trend. So
there's definitely more work to be done with the data collected and by the Waterways Breeding Bird Survey. And it'd be great if we we could get those data used in some research as well as these trends?
Yeah, and what we'll do before we do end, we will sort of, because I will put links to these, we'll let people know how they can get involved. So we'll clear that up before the end. We'll move on to something that's sort of slightly outside of what you would expect to come from the BTO, although I know that they do multiple species now, because you've got dragonflies and butterflies as well. But here's the mammal trends. And clearly, the worrying ones here are sort of things like the rabbits, the mountain hare, and even the hare starting to show a little bit of a decline. And we've talked about disease in birds, but the thing that is impacting on them is, what's happening to them with this hemorrhageal disease.
So in this the 2019 BBS report, we've got a really lovely article. Well, a bit depressing, but by Diana Bell at the University of East Anglia, and she's basically gone through the rabbit and hares and kind of explained some of the things they're up against. And of course, a lot of people will be familiar with myxomatosis, which you see in rabbits, where their eyes tend to be swollen and a little bit icky. And then now, more recently, there's been this hemorrhagic disease, and there's now identified 2 different strains of it in the UK. So that's also getting spread between rabbits in the same way myxomatosis is, but it's also jumped to hares as well. So I've seen it a couple of times, and the rabbits or hare, it's kind of coughing and fitting, and then it seems to die quite quickly, rather than myxomatosis. You can walk past the same poorly rabbit for days and days, but with this hemorrhagic disease, it happens quite quickly. And it's really appears to be having a real knock-on effect to the overall populations of rabbits and hares across the UK, but also regionally and in the different countries as well.
Yeah, and if we were to say, right, okay, well, let's just look at the broader impact on that, and just pick something like the stone curlew. The stone curlew relies heavily on sort of grazed areas, that the grazing in particular done by rabbits. So
so in some places they're putting more sheep out to try and give the rabbits a hand with their habitat management for the stone curlews. So we see that quite a bit around the Brecks and Wheating, more sheep in the fields to try and help the rabbits, because they're really dropping off. But also things like wheat ear, that like a nice short sward to go and forage in, and obviously I've had them sometimes nesting inside the burrows, unused burrows that have been dug by the rabbits as well. So could it be impacting the wheat ears? So it's more than just rabbit trends, really, isn't it?
It is. That's just the thing. This has an impact. It's just like earlier on you mentioned sort of insects, and the impact on sort of birds due to the decline in insects. All of these things are linked. So when you look at something like this, you've got to think of the bigger picture, which brings us back to the the willow tit. You mentioned talking about the willow tit when we got to this one, and I think I can see the reason decline, but I'll let you share that with us.
So we're seeing increases in deer populations throughout the BBS mammal monitoring, and we're seeing 86% increase in roe deer over the last 22 years, and a staggering 172% increase over 22 years in muntjac deer. And there was a paper published a few years back showing the impacts of different deer species on different bird species. So birds nesting and foraging in the understory of woodlands. They're nesting and foraging at different heights in the vegetation layers, and then the deer, being different species, will be browsing in slightly different ways. And you might see that some deer species would have a greater impact on willow tits and song thrush. I can't quite remember the pairing, but it was a really fascinating paper anyway. It gets back to sort of this link. Everything's linked. It's nothing's in isolation, and that includes us as well. So I think it makes me think about we work with a couple of other partners carrying out butterfly surveys on some of our BBS squares, and that provides us data for butterflies and birds on exactly the same site. So there's potential, and there has been some research carried out looking at the relationships between the two different tags on the same site. So that's quite interesting as well. So we're getting 320 of our squares getting covered for butterfly surveys, as well as the birds and the mammals. So it's kind of gathering quite a lot of information together, really.
Yeah, I noticed that because I've just seen you've had an increase in the number of people that are actually doing squares for the wider countryside butterfly survey as well.
Good year. 2019, good year for butterfly surveys.
Yeah.
Because it's an optional extra, so people go back to their squares during the day and can walk the same route that they do for the birds and record the butterflies instead.
Yeah. That's great, because we've got a real sort of background now to sort of the report and what's in the report. So before we go on and tell people how they can get involved, from your point of view, because I know you're not an obsessive bird watcher at all. From your point of view, what in this worries you most? So which species in this worry you most? I know you mentioned the sedge warbler, but and I'm not talking now about Sarah, the BBS National Organiser. I'm talking about Sarah the birder. What worries you most in the report? I
think, well, sedge warbler obviously, because it's my favourite bird. The turtle dove really does, because it's 95% decline in 23 years, and in the last 10 years alone, it's declined by 82%. That is a lot. Willow tit as well, and I think one of the things that concerns me is that as these populations get smaller and smaller and smaller, we're going to have to we might have to start different survey techniques, because this blanket monitoring that the BBS kind of delivers won't be suitable for some of these species as they become rarer and rarer. And then how are we going to be able to track their changes? So I think that kind of bothers me. But yeah, I mean, I'd like to see more research carried out with the WBBS data, because a lot of the species that we're reporting on are in decline. And then it's just, the massive declines in stuff like turtle dove, pied flycatcher, willow tit. That's obviously very worrying. And now we've got this recent decline in chaffinch as well, which is one of our most common and widespread bird species. So everything.
I have to say that was the biggest shock to me, is not just seeing it from the report, but seeing it over the last couple of years. And you just think, no, hang on, because the chaffinch at one stage was vying with the wren, wasn't it, for the most common bird? And now all of a sudden, its numbers are disappearing.
But when I was a kid at Rye we used to have breeding turtle doves, and we used to be able to see into the nest from the track of turtle doves, and we never really thought anything of it. And then they just disappeared, and now they've gone from Rye. And then now we're seeing with chaffinches, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, well, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
But they're obviously in decline, and it's important that this long-term monitoring can flag up things like this and get some research done before it's really, really too late. Yeah,
I think the difference between the chaffinch and the turtle dove is that turtle dove has sort of been quite well publicised. It's changing numbers, and obviously Operation Turtle Dove, which I'll link to, sort of doing some work on that in various ways. I think the chaffinch is sort of, it's a bird that is sort of almost disappearing without us realising it. It's almost, the numbers are just, I mean, I know, I can tell you right now that in this garden I've had one chaffinch in the whole time I've lived here, and I just thought it was because my garden was rubbish. But it's not that bad,
you're worrying a little more,
So and again, greenfinch, I've had one pair of greenfinch in, that was last year, and that's the whole time I've been here. So it is sort of, you worry, because you sort of sit back and think, my garden's just rubbish, but what's actually happening behind the scenes is these birds are actually dropping off, which is really worrying. So to turn it onto a positive note, because we're going to end on a positive, what's in the report as a birder, again, not as Sarah the BBS, what in the report makes you pleased? What pleases you about it? What have you seen in there that goes, yeah, that's really positive?
Again, I think it's the things that I've noticed through the years birding. So as a kid at Rye Meads, if a red kite ever flew over the ringing hut, we'd all have to run outside and have a look at it. We get really, really excited, and I still get excited when I see them flying over, but I'm seeing them most days now, and the BBS is showing a UK increase of 1,738% over the last 23 years. That makes me happy. Yeah. And also things like buzzards are increasing, and yeah, we're seeing some more of our birds of prey about, really. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, red kite in particular, because I mean, that's largely down to sort of reintroduction schemes. But if you look at something like the sedge warbler, for instance, and this is, I'm going off on a tangent. I did tell you that I might go off on a tangent. But something like the sedge warbler, I can't see something like a reintroduction scheme for sedge warblers. It just doesn't hit my radar, doesn't hit my, yeah, I mean, clearly curlews, there is one, they're starting to look at it, and sort of black-tailed godwits. I spoke to Jess from Godwit, and that's great. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, red kite's great. I remember, in fact, I interviewed Allan from Biggest Twitch and talked about my first red kite, because it still sits vividly in my mind. And now, I get the flying over my house at Wyndham. So what I don't get flying over my house at Wyndham at the moment is a swallow. I haven't had one for my garden this year.
Oh, so, well, we're quite lucky where I'm staying at the minute. There's a little pond opposite, and it's in a cattle field. And the cows come down and poach around the edge of the little pond. And there's this right little wet, muddy area around there. And the swallows and the house martins are down there all the time. And of course, for house martins, that's really important to them. They need to be able to get mud that's close to where they want to build their nests. So that's a real limiting factor for their population, and it's right there. So I'm really pleased about that. You can see it from the office.
Yeah, well, I've actually got a bucket of sand sitting in my carport ready to put a mud pack out, but now it's rained, so I will be putting a mud pack out there at some stage. I was going to use it on my face, but that's beyond help. Right. So before we end, let's talk about the citizen science behind this and how people can get involved. I will put links to it, but not just yours, as in the BBS. Just tell us sort of the different types of projects that the BTO have got on that people can get involved in.
Okay, so the one that I've most recently signed up to is Garden Birdwatch, because of course you can do it from your house, and it's free at the minute. And for me, as a birder, all I was doing as soon as we went into lockdown was trying to increase my species list for the garden and seen from the house list. But when I started doing the Garden Birdwatch, you're having to count the maximum counts of each species for the week. So then I started to find out that I get 6 blackbirds to the garden. And I don't know if I would have really noticed that if I hadn't been my attention hadn't been focused to that sort of information through the survey. So that's quite a good one, and it's quite it's a relatively easy survey to get into, because you're only recording the birds that are visiting your garden. You'll often be quite familiar with those, so it's kind of a really nice survey to start off with, really. There's Bird Track as well, which people can do from their home as well, and that's just the recording software. So instead of writing down all of your bird counts in a notebook, I still do, but then I put them into Bird Track. You can enter them onto an online system and onto an app, and record the birds kind of ad hoc as and when. So that's another nice one. So BBS, WBBS and webs are suspended at the minute, but that's subject to change at any minute, of course, as things develop. But the Wetland Bird Survey, that's a monthly count on a local pond or reservoir, and in estuaries as well. Again, that's kind of more of a visual survey, so that's quite a good one for folk who know their waders and their ducks and eclipse as well. So when the males and females look very similar. And then, of course, we've got the heronry census, which is finished now for the year anyway. But that's basically monitoring heron nests little egret nests. So again, that's quite a nice one if you want to just learn a couple of species. And then for BBS and WBBS, you kind of need to know your birds by sight and sound for the square you're going to be surveying. So that can vary quite a lot. You know, you've got a Welsh woodland where you're going to be having to do everything by sound, pretty much. You won't see very many birds, but you'll need to know all the calls and songs, through to kind of the uplands of Scotland when you're on top of a mountain and you can see for miles, and a lot of the birds you'll be seeing them. So you're kind of you can rely a lot more on vision rather than sound. So I mean, the skill level required is definitely a square by square kind of decision. But if you know the bird you're likely to see on the squares that you've been offered, then of course we're very keen for you to take part.
Yeah, and I can recommend looking on the BTO site. There's not only the great projects you can get involved with, all of the records that go into the BTO are all used in various different reports, but also there's training courses that you can go on that are really good, delivered by various people, but Nick as well. So yeah, it's worth definitely going on the BTO site, having a look what's there, and I can highly recommend the Garden Bird Watch, because the reporting tool on that, on your homepage, the dashboard, is fantastic. That I just love that, because I mean I love anything like that, but it's really, really cool. So yeah, I would definitely start there and then get involved with more, because they are brilliant. So right, I will put links on YouTube and people can come in and have a look.
Yeah.
And for now, I think we'll leave it there. So Sarah, thanks ever so much for your time.
Thank you, and thank you to the volunteers that took part in the survey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is just it, you know, citizen science is absolutely crucial, you know, because certainly the BTO couldn't employ, you know, the number of people that they would need to produce a report like this. So
yeah, it's over 3,000 volunteers that have taken part in BBS and WBBS combined. So
yeah,
a lot of time and effort. We couldn't do it without them, for sure.
And the thing is, I mean, you know, it's not only worthwhile, it is great. You know, when I discovered Bird Track for the first time about 8 years ago, something like that, 7, 8 years ago, I just had my laptop crash, and all of my Excel spreadsheets that had all of my bird records going back years, fortunately I had books as well, just went. So I wasn't happy. Since then I've discovered Bird Track, and Bird Track is a fantastic tool, you know, because you can do it out in the field while you're doing it. You don't have to worry about writing down. Some people still do, but it's really good. So yeah, whether you're new to birding or whether you're an existing birder, if you don't already use Bird Track, use it. And you know, if you're not involved in any of the projects on BTO, I highly recommend them. Right, Sarah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will hopefully see you out birding at some stage.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. We'll ask Boris, but at some stage.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.